Imagine a disappearance where almost everyone has been looking in the same direction for more than 30 years. A bus leaving Dublin. A village in the Wicklow Mountains. A famous pub. A young American woman apparently moving farther and farther away from her home. And then she vanishes. That is a story most people know about Annie McCarrick. But there is a problem. A very big problem. Because when you separate what people reported seeing from what investigators can actually confirm, Annie's final journey begins to look very different. And it raises a question that changes almost everything about this case. Did Annie McCarrick actually leave Dublin that day? Or had people spent decades following a journey that may never have happened? To answer that, we need to go back to Friday, March 26, 1993. Annie McCarrick was 26 years old. She was originally from New York, but Ireland had become an important part of her life. She had studied there before, returned to the United States, and then, in January of 1993, moved back to Ireland. She was living with two other tenants in Sandymount, Dublin. She worked as a waitress. She had friends. She had plans. Nothing about that Friday morning looked like the beginning of a mystery that would still be unsolved more than 3 decades later. That morning, Annie spoke with both of her flatmates before they separately left for the weekend. Then Annie went out. Shortly before 11 in the morning, she visited the Allied Irish Bank branch on Sandymount Road. Investigators say this is the last confirmed sighting of Annie. Remember those words. Last confirmed sighting. Because they are going to become extremely important. Annie also bought groceries that morning. The receipt showed a time of 11:02. Those groceries later turned up inside her apartment. Still in the shopping bags. Still unpacked. And according to investigators, that purchase represents the last confirmed activity involving Annie McCarrick. After that, the story changes. Because after that, we enter the world of reported sightings. There were reports that Annie was seen around Sandymount Green. There were reports that she boarded the number 44 bus toward Enniskerry. There were reported sightings in Enniskerry itself. And later, there was a reported sighting at Johnnie Fox's pub in Glencullen. Put those sightings together and you get a very clear story. Annie leaves Sandymount. She travels toward the mountains. She reaches Enniskerry. She eventually appears at Johnnie Fox's. And sometime after that, something happens to her. For years, that route became almost inseparable from Annie's disappearance. But here is where we need to stop. Because investigators today do not describe those later movements in the same way they describe the bank or the groceries. They call them reported sightings. The difference between those two words and the word confirmed is the entire reason we are looking at this case again. So let us test the possibilities. Theory number 1. Annie really did travel to Wicklow and the witnesses were correct. This is possible. Multiple people reportedly believed they had seen her. A woman matching Annie's description was reported on the number 44 bus heading toward Enniskerry. There were further reports in Enniskerry. Then came the reported sighting at Johnnie Fox's. Several sightings pointing in roughly the same direction can feel powerful. And there is another reason this theory became so convincing. Older accounts of the case often described Annie's journey toward Enniskerry almost as if it were part of an established timeline. If you learned about the case through those accounts, it would be easy to believe that Annie's journey into Wicklow was confirmed. But later official appeals became much more careful. They described the bus, Enniskerry, and Johnnie Fox's as reported sightings. And they identify Sandymount as the location of her last confirmed activity. That does not mean the witnesses were wrong. It means we cannot treat their memories like security camera footage. So theory number 1 remains possible. Annie may have traveled to Wicklow, but it is not proven. Now, theory number 2. Some of the sightings were correct. Others were not. This may sound less dramatic, but logically it is extremely important. Imagine Annie really was seen around Sandymount after buying her groceries. Then imagine somebody later sees a similar-looking woman boarding a bus. Another person hears that Annie may have traveled toward Enniskerry and remembers seeing a woman who looked like her. Then another person remembers someone at a pub. None of those witnesses needs to be lying. Nobody needs to invent anything. Human memory does not work like a recording. A person can sincerely believe they recognize somebody and still be mistaken. And once a possible route begins forming, later sightings can appear to reinforce earlier sightings. Sandymount, bus, Enniskerry, pub. It becomes a chain. But a chain of eyewitness reports is only as strong as the individual links. If one identification is wrong, the next sighting may suddenly become much less meaningful. So perhaps Annie began that journey. Perhaps 1 or 2 witnesses genuinely saw her. But perhaps the final part of the route belongs to another woman entirely. That theory fits the evidence because investigators have never publicly upgraded those later sightings to confirmed movements. Now, theory number 3. Annie never went to Wicklow at all. This is where the case becomes fascinating. Strip everything uncertain away. Forget the bus for a moment. Forget Enniskerry. Forget the pub. What do we actually know? We know Annie was in Sandymount that morning. We know she visited the bank. We know she bought groceries. We know those groceries ended up back inside her apartment. And we know they were found unpacked. Then the confirmed trail stops. That is it. Everything beyond that point is less certain. So ask the uncomfortable question. What if the disappearance happened much closer to home? What if the reason nobody ever found the answer in Wicklow is because Wicklow was never where the real mystery began? Again, that does not mean Annie definitely remained in Dublin. There is no evidence proving that. But there is also no confirmed public evidence establishing that she reached Enniskerry. And this becomes even more interesting when you look at Annie's plans. She had invited friends to dinner at her apartment the following day. Her mother was due to arrive from New York only days later. Annie had work commitments. When her friends arrived for the dinner she had arranged, Annie was not there. She also failed to appear for work. Then her groceries were discovered sitting inside the apartment. There was nothing there that tells us Annie was preparing to abandon her life. Which brings us to theory number 4. Annie disappeared voluntarily. Could she simply have decided to leave? When somebody initially goes missing, investigators have to consider different possibilities. But this theory becomes difficult when tested against Annie's known behavior. She had made plans with friends. Her mother was coming to visit. She had bought groceries. She had work. And after disappearing, there was no confirmed trace establishing that Annie had started another life somewhere else. More importantly, Irish police formally changed Annie's case from a missing person investigation to a murder investigation in March of 2023. That does not tell us exactly what happened, but it makes the idea of a carefully planned voluntary disappearance extremely difficult to reconcile with the direction of the investigation. So of all the explanations we have examined, voluntary disappearance is one of the weakest. Now consider theory number 5. The Wicklow sightings unintentionally sent everyone in the wrong direction. This does not require a conspiracy. It does not require dishonest witnesses. It only requires one thing: mistaken identification. Imagine being an investigator in 1993. A young woman disappears. Someone says they saw her on a bus. Another person reports seeing her in Enniskerry. Another person believes they saw her later at a well-known pub. suddenly you have a route. And once you have a route, you have places to search, people to interview, areas to concentrate on. The mountains become important. The pub becomes important. The journey becomes important. But what happens if the woman on that bus was not Annie? Then perhaps the woman in Enniskerry was not Annie either. And suddenly, the famous final journey disappears. You were back in Sandymount, back at the bank, back with the groceries, back at 11 in the morning. That possibility is not something we have invented. When investigators announced the murder investigation, they said they were exploring other possibilities concerning where Annie went that day. That statement matters. After decades of investigation, the journey was still not closed. Then, more than 30 years after Annie disappeared, something major happened. In June of 2025, investigators arrested a man in connection with the murder investigation. They also carried out searches at a property in Clondalkin, Dublin. The man was later released without charge. That fact is crucial. An arrest is not proof of guilt. Being questioned does not establish responsibility. And nothing about that development allows us to accuse that man of Annie's murder. The investigation continued. The search of the property eventually ended, and police said details were not being released for operational reasons. But think about what the development tells us in relation to our question. More than 3 decades later, this investigation was not simply concentrated on a final journey deep into Wicklow. Investigators were still actively examining possibilities connected to Dublin. So now we can return to the question. Did Annie McCarrick leave Dublin on March 26, 1993? The most accurate answer is this. We do not know. But we can say something much more important. There is no confirmed public evidence establishing that Annie reached Enniskerry. There is no confirmed public evidence establishing that she reached Johnnie Fox's. Those are reported sightings. The last confirmed evidence places Annie in Sandymount. And that completely changes how we should think about the case. Because the question should never have been, what happened to Annie after she left Johnnie Fox's? That question assumes something we cannot prove. The better question is, what happened to Annie after Sandymount? Maybe she boarded that bus. Maybe the witnesses were correct. Maybe she traveled all the way into the Wicklow Mountains. That possibility remains alive. But logically, it has to compete with another possibility. That some, or perhaps all, of the later sightings were mistaken. And if that happened, then investigators were not dealing with a woman who vanished somewhere at the end of a long journey into Wicklow. They were dealing with a woman whose confirmed trail ended close to her home in Dublin. That is the most important conclusion. Not that Annie definitely stayed in Dublin. We cannot say that. Not that the Wicklow witnesses were definitely wrong. We cannot say that either. The conclusion is simpler. For more than 30 years, one of the most famous parts of Annie McCarrick's story has remained unconfirmed. And when a case is unsolved for this long, the difference between what we believe happened and what we can prove happened becomes incredibly important. Annie's groceries were inside her apartment. Her plans were waiting for her. Her mother was about to arrive. And somewhere after that ordinary Friday morning in Sandymount, the confirmed trail suddenly ended. Maybe the answer is hidden somewhere along the road to Wicklow. But there is another possibility. Maybe the biggest mistake is assuming Annie ever took that road at all. And if that assumption is wrong, then the real mystery of Annie McCarrick may have been much closer to home from the very beginning.